And then Mr. Martin, Jim Martin, could you do a quick audio check for us? I believe you're the last one.
Okay, Alex, we're streaming live to YouTube. You can go ahead and start the meeting whenever you're ready.
Great. Go ahead and do that now. Lisa, can you proceed to the next slide, please? Well, welcome everyone. It's been a couple months since our last meeting, our last virtual meeting, that is. So I want to welcome everyone, those of you who are joining us to the working group for the first time, but really welcome everyone back to the 2045 Plan Working Group. I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. Again, my name is Alex Trauger. I am the project manager for the 25 plan at Metro Plan Orlando. You know, we've done a lot to make sure the meeting is going to run smoothly. But during our next slide, I'm going to show a short video. Actually, before I do that, let me talk quickly about the agenda here. You know, the real focus of today is to talk about the multimodal needs assessment. But before I do that, I'll talk a little bit about scenario planning. We'll keep microphones muted unless you're recognized to speak. And as we practiced earlier, we're going to be able to raise our virtual hands to participate in the discussion. You also see that there's a chat feature in your toolbox, in your toolbar rather. This will communicate with all panelists in this meeting, which will include members, staff, as well as presenters. You can use this if you're having any technical issues, need assistance, or have a question during today's presentations. You know, please know that the chat comments will be included as public record for this meeting, so please keep that in mind. We want this and all of our future online meetings to be, if you can go to the next slide, please. We're going to play a short video here. Start off with that.
Welcome to Metro Plan Orlando's virtual meeting. Here are some things you should know. Board and committee members are active participants, and members of the public are observers. Our chairperson will make sure to keep the meeting flowing. Please keep your microphone or phone line muted unless recognized to speak. Make sure to pay attention to your video controls as well. Participants are welcome to use the raise hand feature to ask questions after presentations. This feature can be found when clicking on the participants icon. When recognized by the chair to speak, you can unmute yourself. Please make sure to speak clearly so everyone can hear you. You may also submit questions via the chat box by clicking on the chat icon. A moderator will relay your question. Thank you.
Mute myself. So again, you know, just be mindful of your mute button if you want to be recognized. We want this meeting and really all of our meetings, as I mentioned before, to be accessible to the public. So participants may join, you know, by computer, tablet, or phone. And if you need accommodations to participate in the future, please contact Metro Plan Orlando using the contact information shown on this slide. Go to the next slide, please. So, you know, there's a public comment period near the end of the agenda on this meeting. Members of the public who want to speak will use the raise hand feature found in the participants tab. If members of the public are attending by phone, they can hit *9 to raise their virtual hand and request to be recognized. When you're called, your microphone will be temporarily unmuted by staff, and we'll ask that you state your name and contact information for the record as we typically would. We'll also be accepting comments by phone and email before this meeting. I don't believe we received any to date, given that this is not an action-oriented body. But at this time, before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and call attendance. So all working group members, if you could, please go ahead and unmute yourselves in preparation for this roll call. I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. And then once your name is called, you recognize yourself, you can mute yourself again. Also, please make sure your video is turned on if possible so we can confirm it's you. And if you could leave that video on throughout the duration of the meeting, it would be greatly appreciated. When your name is called, please say here or present. Bill Wharton.
Here.
Thanks, Bill. Bob O'Malley.
Here.
Bob. Brad Friel. Carol Scott.
I'm actually here, Siasi Fine for Carol Scott.
Great, thanks, Siasi. Cheryl Stone. Cheryl. Okay. Chris Cairns.
Here.
Morning. Conroy Jacobs.
Here. I'll get the video working in a minute.
Thanks, Conroy. Dan Stevens, Dr. Dan.
Here.
Daryl Kronk. Daryl. Fred Milch. I know you're here 3 times.
Yep.
Good morning, Fred. Graciela.
Present.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hazem Elisar. Jeff Pegram.
Present.
Thanks, Jeff. Jim Martin. See you're on, but we'll reach out, see if you're having any audio technical difficulties. Kathy Lee.
Here.
Kathy. Kelly Brock.
Here.
Lee Pullum.
Here.
Michael Aller.
Here.
Miles.
Here.
Rachel Cobb.
Here.
You're welcome, Rachel. Thank you for joining us today. Rakenya Hinson. So let's see, you're on the line. Tamika Monterville. I believe, Miles, you're filling in for Tamika today.
Correct.
Correct. Venice White.
Present.
Will Hawthorne.
Here.
Great. That's everyone. Thanks for joining. We're also joined today by Maitland Mayor Dale McDonald. So, Mayor, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Great. We can go on to the next slide, please. So before we jump into the kind of the heart of today's conversation, just want to talk briefly about our process. You know, this is actually the 5th meeting of our working group. You know, we started early on, you know, talking about existing conditions and kind of where we're at today, which helped us a lot as we talked about scenario planning at our last meeting. This group also helped us establish those goals and objectives, which are really guiding the next steps of our planning process. But the real focus of today's discussion is needs assessment. And we're going to talk really about that today. And just as another reminder, as I've said at every meeting, we have 2 more meetings of this working group later this year before we adopt, and our board and our advisory committees will make a recommendation for adoption in December of this year during their November-December board cycle. We can go to the next slide, please. So like I said, just want to, you know, our last discussion we had with the working group was on scenario planning, but we've covered a lot of ground, you know, since the last time that we've met as a group. We can go to the next slide. So since our last meeting, our last working group meeting, that is, you know, we took the information that we refined during that working group meeting and took it to our advisory committees and board, and our board actually has taken that topic up twice. We got a lot of good feedback from our advisory committees and the board. We conducted a similar polling exercise as we did with the working group, talking about how we should include scenario planning in the 2045 plan. And a lot of the feedback was constant with the information that the working group provided about using scenario planning to inform decision making, to help evaluate needs, and to really ensure that we're selecting appropriate mitigation strategies to plan for the future and some of those disruptions that we may face. We've been working as a technical team to really better define and refine the scenario parameters. So as we talk about growth and these percentages and rates of growth, we're working back with some of our forecasting tools, to make sure that we can actually begin to quantify these scenarios. As we've talked a couple times before, for this process, scenario planning is a narrative, it's a storytelling exercise, but also it's our job as a technical or a planning team to look at the impacts and how we may quantify those using some of the planning tools and methods that we're going to talk about today, ultimately to prepare for the future. We can go to the next slide. So, we gained a lot of feedback from the working group and especially our community advisory committee and our technical advisory committee. They provided us some real insights and really raised attention to an issue. And it's the circumstances that we're faced with today. And our advisory committees, especially our municipal advisory committee and the board saw this at their meetings this past month. But we're introducing a new scenario, and that's based on the feedback that we received. And as I mentioned, our current circumstances. So this scenario we're calling disruption dilemmas. And it's really, as it's stated on a slide, a world or a scenario where pandemics and other emergencies actually disrupt and impact population, visitor, and economic growth rates, and how that actually impacts society as it relates to transportation, travel behaviors, as well as development patterns. So as you can see, here we're looking at higher rate of people working remotely, so that telework focus, as we're having a virtual meeting today, potentially lower density development patterns, based on that teleworking, as well as, some fear of those urbanized environments. As many of us have experienced, we're ordering a lot more online in that curbside delivery, so that's going to be a focus and how that may be impacted as part of our plan. We're also seeing a lot more active transportation, a lot more people riding their bikes, being outside in general. Our trail use is going up, so there's more people getting out there trying to get out of their house. Also concerns though, and this plan will acknowledge that, just some anxiety or concern as it relates to some of those shared mobility options, which could impact and really increase our reliance on single occupancy vehicles. So like I said, this is a scenario that came out of some of the insights and feedback that were received during our advisory committee process, and that some of you actually mentioned, at our last meeting as well. So that helped us take a look at the original 4 scenarios and helped us redefine how we're going to move forward. We can go to the next slide. So these are going to be our alternative futures. 3 of these 4 were presented to you in detail at our last meeting. You may recall we had one scenario called global expansion. In that scenario, we're actually, based on the feedback that we received during polling and some of the feedback as well through our advisory committees, we're actually eliminating that particular scenario and instead substituting it with our disruption dilemma scenario. So this range of scenarios actually gives us a really full spectrum of scenarios. We have our traditional trends. That's our trend scenario. We have our climate consequences, and even though that's kind of an ominous title, as we've talked about in the past, that's our high growth scenario. Given those shifts of population from coastal areas, we're seeing higher economic growth, higher population growth. We have our disruption dilemma scenario. That's going to be our low growth scenario and some of the travel impacts associated with that lower growth. And then we have a tech transformation scenario. So this is where we're really embodying and embracing technology. So that's our technology forward future. I believe this gives us a good range of scenarios. We're not just looking at the up and up, not just on the positive trend, but we're going to be looking at all directions and how that may impact the transportation system in project development. We can go to the next slide, please. So again, as we move forward in this process, we just want to have clear expectations for our advisory committees as well as you as a working group. And as technical staff, as I mentioned earlier, we're beginning that process of really refining those parameters, putting them into action, doing the steps necessary to begin the quantification of impacts that technical planning process using our different models and other planning tools. But what's going to come out of this is needs associated with the transportation system as we've traditionally forecasted. But we're also going to be looking at more of those long-term policy implications, some of those strategies, some of those things that we need to consider, study more, research more as we plan into the future. Next slide, please. So again, this kind of sums it up, but it's really what I've already addressed. We're going to use our baseline, that trend scenario, and then we're going to use our other 3 scenarios to begin to look at how our future may change, how that impacts travel demand, supply and demand rather, looking at those long-term impacts, how we need to prepare for the future, how those futures and those needs may be unique to each scenario. And as I mentioned, developing documentation to explain that in general terms, but also to explain the impact side of scenario planning. Does anyone have, we can go to the next slide. I believe that's it for scenario planning. But before I moved on, does anyone have any quick questions in regards to scenario planning? I know we spent probably about an hour and a half at our last working group meeting working through that. So, but I wanted to, pause here for a moment and see if there are any questions before we dive into core content for today.
Just a reminder to raise your hand. If you will hit your participant button on the bottom of your toolbar, you will find that raise hand button at the very bottom of that window.
Thanks, Cynthia. So seeing none, we'll jump right into core content. And, as I mentioned before, needs assessment, our methods and approach is really the core of today's discussion. If you're on one of our advisory committees or a member of our board, you would have seen a similar presentation at their round of committees this past month. Today's, we're going to dive a lot deeper into those methods, talk through examples and showcase some of the preliminary findings that we have. But I believe it's important, and many of you have heard me say this today, there's a real paradigm shift in our planning process. Our 2040 plan, which was adopted 5 years ago, in previous long-range transportation plans were really looked at volume to capacity ratios. They focused primarily on solving for congestion, getting the red out of the system. And that provided us, capacity projects, roadway widening projects, and that was the extent of it. And if that were our methodology for today, this presentation would be very quick. That would be it. Is that volume to capacity ratio 1 or greater? But it's really a new day in our planning process, and the 2045 plan will encapsulate that paradigm shift. We're going to be looking at multimodal needs, multimodal opportunities that align in an attempt to accomplish our regional goals and objectives that this working group helped define. We can go to the next slide. So given the complexity of the transportation system, we have multiple approaches to analyze that multimodal system. And that's really going to address all user types. So we're going to have a bicycle and pedestrian approach that our presenter will talk about today. That's going to look at both cycle opportunities as well as those pedestrian, walking along the system, but also how we cross the system safely. We have a transit approach that's going to focus on those bus and rail connections. And lastly, we're going to be looking more comprehensively at that roadway network, and we'll talk about that here today. So during this presentation, I did the entire presentation for our advisory committees. Like I said, we moved through it pretty quickly, 15 minutes to cover everything that we're going to be talking about over the next, hour and 15 minutes. But let's jump right into things. And when we're going to talk about our pedestrian and bicycle needs assessment. We can go to the next slide, and I'll let Caitlin introduce herself.
Thanks, Alex. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm seeing nodded heads. Okay, good. My name is Caitlin Tobin. I'm a senior engineer with Kittleson and Associates, and I'm going to be talking about the pedestrian and bicycle needs assessment that we worked on today, and diving into some of the details of the methodology and the results. Just a little background on myself. I've been in active transportation planning for a little over 10 years now. Have had the opportunity and honor to do ped bike planning and design throughout the East Coast, and really neat opportunities to do it throughout Florida. Worked with Hillsborough County, Coral Gables, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and have gotten a really neat opportunity to do this with MetroPlan as well in the Orlando and surrounding area. And we'll dive straight into the content. So if we can go to the next slide. So just an overview of what we achieved in this task. And first, in looking at existing conditions, that's always kind of our starting point of where do we have existing active transportation facilities, and where do we have gaps? Where do we have a lack of facilities? And we built off that to do two things, both the bicycle needs assessment, where are their needs at the network level, what are our needs when it comes to projects, and then also the pedestrian needs assessment. If we can go to the next slide. And I can dive into that. I'm going to dive into that a little bit deeper, starting with the bicycle needs assessment. So we leveraged a tool as part of both identifying where there's bike facilities, but understanding the existing conditions of the bike network. We leveraged a tool called Bicycle LTS, or Bicycle Level of Traffic Stress. And it's a methodology that's been around for about 7 or 8 years now. It's widely used in the industry because it's really known as the best methodology to understand how a user on a bike feels when they're using either a bike facility or a street facility, and measures how comfortable they are to bike on. And what we're trying to do is understand how useful is the network for the general population. So it helps us identify, one, where are bike facilities, and if they're there, are they appropriate for the roadway context, given the speed, the volume, the number of lanes? And then also identify where are projects that are going to leverage existing streets and trails that are already comfortable to bike on. Next slide. And so what the level of traffic stress does is it uses a couple different data points about a roadway, again, number of lanes, traffic volume, speeds, and it categorizes bike facilities and streets into one of 4 categories. And the score is LTS 1 or 2. These are streets that most of the general population feels comfortable riding on, right? These are streets with separated bike lanes, trails, or those low volume, low speed streets where maybe some of you learned to ride a bike in the street in front of your house. There maybe necessarily wasn't a bike lane, but it was safe to do that, and it was comfortable to do that. And that's the network we're trying to achieve, right? We're trying to create a useful network for the general population. LTS 3 is kind of that street that a confident bicyclist, someone who rides regularly or maybe rides for exercise on the weekend, would feel comfortable and confident riding in. And then LTS 4 are those streets, and we have it kind of in the smallest block of space because even really experienced bicyclists wouldn't be comfortable riding on that facility or on that street. So we actually went through and screened the entire network and assigned one of these scores, whether there was a bike or a bike facility or not, because we're starting at a point where we're not just assuming because there's a bike facility, the gap is filled. We need to make sure the bike facility is appropriate for the street context. And if we go to the next slide, we can dive into kind of the details of how we did that. So the LTS methodology uses a lot of data points. It can be very complex. And we've found both in digesting it a little bit in its application in several places, there's actually a handful of parameters that really help us identify the LTS score to a reasonable degree of accuracy. And Some of this guidance is actually in the FHWA Separated Bike Lane Design Guide, which we helped author. And it breaks down some of this in terms of number of lanes, traffic speeds, traffic volumes. And what we've been able to do is identify two, I guess, flowchart methodologies. One where we're using for mixed traffic assessment. So these are facilities or streets where bikes are expected to share the lane with traffic, and identifying the LTS score that way. And we'll go into a second methodology when a bike facility is present. So again, using our parameters to kind of screen the network, the first thing we use in the mixed traffic assessment is the speed limit. What is the speed limit? And in our general, again, assessment, 35 miles per hour or over, and there's no bike facility, that's an LTS4 street. That's not a condition most people would feel comfortable biking on. And then we get down into some of the nuances. So at 30 miles per hour, we start to look at other data points. So at 30 miles per hour, how many lanes are there? And in our data set, the number of lanes was really used as a proxy for traffic volumes. It was a more reliable data point than for the entire network that we were able to depend on. We do have a final screening set where we used traffic volumes, which I'll get to after going through these two. But for the overall network, we did use number of travel lanes. If it's up to 3 travel lanes, we dove down a little bit deeper into the adjacent land use. So in a residential area, it's an LTS2. In a commercial area, it's an LTS3. The reason we bump it up because of commercial activity is because traffic patterns tend to create a little bit more friction. There may be high turnover parking, driveways that have a little bit higher use. So we tend to consider that environment a little more stressful. If there's 4 or more lanes, it's an LTS4. For lower speed streets, again, we use the residential area or the commercial area to really define whether it's an LTS1 or 2 if there's up to 3 lanes. At 4 or 5 lanes, that's an LTS3. And if there's 6 or more lanes, even if the street's only 25 miles per hour, it's an LTS4. Next slide.
Hey, Caitlin, we have a question in the chat box for you. Dan Stevens asks, what is the difference between the level of traffic stress versus Bruce Landis bicycle level of service? And Dan, if you want to unmute yourself and add anything to that, please go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
You're muted, Dan. Can you hit unmute for me? Thanks.
Sorry about that. I thought I was unmuted. I don't know if you're familiar with the Bruce Landis level of service. I assume you probably are, but it seemed like it was very comprehensive. It included other factors such as the presence of heavy traffic, buffers, and things of this nature. You know, I just wasn't sure if you're kind of going the same direction, just including or other factors, or can you kind of distinguish between the two approaches?
Yeah. So I am familiar with bicycle level service. I'm not sure if it's the same one as Bruce's Landis. I'll have to check on that that I'm thinking of. We actually did kind of a deep dive white paper on this very topic about bicycle level of traffic stress, bicycle level of service, multimodal level of service, and the differences between some of these methodologies. And the challenge with the level of service methodology is it, again, without being sure that I'm speaking directly to the Bruce Landis, the challenge we find with using bicycle level service is level service tries to make a comparison to traffic level service, right? It gives a score of A through F. And what we find is you then could be making the mistake of really making an apples to comparison of traffic level service, which measures speed and convenience, and bicycle level of service, which is measuring safety and comfort. And so a level of service C for bikes and a level of service C for traffic, well, for traffic it's acceptable. For bikes, that might actually be the difference between someone choosing to bike or not. So I think in general in the industry, we've tried to move away from using level of service as that A through F methodology because it tries to create that apples to apples comparison when you're really, it's really not apples to apples. And we use, and then into why we use level of traffic stress, it's really useful because it ends up looking at the entire network and helping us do network planning versus kind of facility to facility planning and doing what we've done in the past, which is create orphan facility to orphan facility instead of trying to connect the overall network. I don't know if
Caitlin,
that, yeah.
sorry to interrupt, this is Alex. I just wanted to, Dan, there are some similarities there. You know, I was just kind of looking over the level of stress model. I think for our analysis, since we're doing this regional approach, I think it's really more about data availability and us to be able to replicate it on that systems level analysis. The level of traffic stress, or rather the level of service, as Caitlin mentioned, is a little more of a straightforward model. You know, where the level of service incorporates, I'm looking here, probably about 12 or 15 different parameters. So I think there are some similarities, but I think they're getting at that same approach of what's comfortable, looking at number of lanes, context, speed, and things of that nature. So I think there's some similarities, nuanced in nature, but our approach, I think, is, you know, follows a FHWA example and some work that has been done here in Florida. So we're adapting those more recent approaches and doing that work here in Central Florida.
Yeah, it's not that I just want to be clear. I'm not necessarily against this. I've never actually, seen this before. I think you're right on that you're shooting for the level of comfort for the rider. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what type of facilities you have or whatever. If people aren't comfortable using those facilities, then you've lost that. You've lost that rider. So it's not that I'm against this. I just wanted to find out if you're kind of going the same direction. That's all.
It's a really good question. Any other questions before I dive in to the next set of assessment? Okay, this is good. Yeah, please use the chat box or raise your hand. I love to answer questions along the way. Okay, so similar to the mixed traffic assessment, we created a separate assessment for if a bike facility is present. So again, we don't assume just because a bike facility is present, it's comfortable. We really want to understand what's the facility type and is it appropriate for the roadway type, or the roadway characteristics. So we start with the question of what facility is present. If it's a sharrow, which is, for some of you, a sharrow is basically that when there's the bike with the chevron arrows, the share the lane arrows on a street, or signed routes, for instance, if there's just posted signs that says, this is generally a comfortable bike route, then we use the mixed traffic assessment process. We don't consider those dedicated bike facilities. They are bike facilities, but they are more communication tools to drivers to expect bicyclists, and bicyclists are still going to mix with traffic. So we tend to use the mixed traffic assessment for those facilities. If there's a separated bike lane or shared use path, as long as there's no major design flaws that we know of, we consider that a level of traffic stress 1. In pretty much all cases, those are considered comfortable for the general population. And then where we get into some additional deeper dive questions is if a bike lane or a buffered bike lane is present. And if the speed is over 40 miles per hour, without a separated facility, we consider that to be an LTS4. And by separated, I mean there's physical separation between the person riding a bike and traffic. So a bike lane or buffered bike lane does not meet that requirement. If it's 35 miles per hour, And then we consider that an LTS3. Someone who's confident in biking would feel comfortable riding in a bike lane or a buffered bike lane along that street, but maybe not someone in the general population. And then if it's lower than 35 miles per hour, so we get down to 30 miles per hour, 25 miles per hour, lower streets, we really need to look at things like where is there friction, where are there door zones, how wide are the bike lanes and the buffered bike lanes. And so that's where we start to ask the question, is it next to parking? This tends to be, you're down to a handful of streets that have bike lanes on 30 to 25 miles per hour street. And so we go through and actually do the detailed analysis of, okay, if you're next to parking, are you greater than or equal to or less than 13 feet wide? And that tells us whether the street is an LTS 2 or 3. And then if it's not next to parking, we actually have a couple more thresholds where if the bike lane is next to the curb and it's greater than 6 feet wide and it's, again, 30 miles per hour, 25 miles per hour, that can actually be pretty comfortable for most people. So can get a score of LTS 1 or 2. If it's a more narrow bike lane next to the curb, we're looking at like an LTS 3 where someone, again, confident would be willing to bike there. Next slide. So it was actually brought to our attention through I believe the technical advisory committee that there may be low speed conditions with low number of lanes, like some of the examples you have here on North Winter Park Drive, that would score an LTS 1 or 2, but the vehicles per day or the traffic volumes, or what we sometimes call AADT, average annual daily traffic, would actually make the street more stressful, even though it's lower speed and has lower lanes. And the reason for that is that steady, while it's slower moving traffic, that steady flow of traffic, maybe especially in the peak hour, does create friction and conflict points for bicyclists. And so recognizing that, we actually added a volume screening process where we screened the entire network after we did the initial assessment and identified where do we have LTS 1 or 2 streets where we have over 6,500 vehicles per day. And where we had those, we manually assigned them to have an LTS 3. We kind of recognize that as a threshold of where even if there's a bike lane, even if it's low volume, it's still probably only be comfortable for people who are confident in biking with that much traffic on the street. And then for mixed traffic streets that scored an LTS 1 or 2, if they had over 3,500 vehicles per day, we again manually reassigned that score to LTS 3, recognizing that's a threshold of traffic that's, again, that slow could end up being that slow, consistent, steady stream of traffic and enough conflict points. So we really appreciated that feedback, because then we were able to identify a couple of cases like North Winter Park Drive where we need to make some manual adjustments. Next slide. Okay, so why is all this useful for network planning? And what it really boiled down to is, in our next set of exercise, was developing something called low stress islands. And it's really more a visual tool and a network tool to understand what parts of the network are useful and how are projects going to impact connecting those parts of the network that are already comfortable to bike in. So there's a couple of green and blue blobs on the screen, for lack of a better technical term. And essentially, in any one of these green blobs, you can get from one side of the green blob to the other via continuous low stress trip before you hit a barrier, what we consider barriers, an LTS 3 or an LTS 4. And what the methodology allows us to do is understand, okay, if we have tip projects, if we have prioritized projects, how are they helping better connect the network? And this is just a case example. But for instance, the trail, I have a red circle around kind of the middle of the screen. The blue trail that runs along I-4 that's proposed in the tip really only connects a few small low stress islands along the side of it. But if we add, and this is part of the exercise that we did, was identified, okay, where can lower cost supporting projects like the dark green line we have coming off the trail extend the reach and overall impact of that project? Because again, we've in the industry, we've done a lot of times build really nice bike facilities from nowhere to nowhere, and we wonder why no one rides on them. It's because we got to make sure that the entire adjacent population can actually reach the high quality facility. So we're actually going through the process now of comparing this with Orlando's master plan and like this specific study to just make sure supporting projects we identified are lining up with that. We've also done it with some of the list of prioritized projects. And the idea is we come out with sets of projects where, okay, if you're going to do this big investment, then these are supporting projects that you need in order to really maximize that investment. Because if you're going to do a $5 million trail project, you might as well do a $200,000 supporting project to maximize its use and help both make those decisions, but then also at the next stage of the project, ultimately prioritize those projects for implementation. The last thing we'll do is also we'll have this list of projects that are really needed and understand how they overall impact the network, but then also identify, based on the LTS scores we've identified, what are the most appropriate bike facilities for those street characteristics as well. So identifying the need from the network level, but also identifying what are the specific types of facilities that are appropriate for the corridors that are needed to connect the overall network. So I'll pause there and see if there are any questions. And yeah, before I dive into some of the next stuff around pedestrian assessment.
Okay, well, you can keep going.
Great. Okay, great. So let's go to the next slide. And this is just a final slide. We have put all the final results on a Google map, which we'll share after this meeting. So we definitely invite you all to look through it in your particular communities and let us know if you have feedback. Next slide. Okay, so we conducted the bike needs assessment, and then we also wanted to look at the pedestrian needs assessment from two perspectives, sidewalks and then also crossing opportunities. So how do we move along the network on sidewalks as pedestrians, but then also how do we permeate the network by having crossing opportunities? And so this first assessment is the sidewalk needs assessment. We really did a screening of, first of all, we had a really nice data set of where are we missing sidewalks on both sides of the street, where are we missing sidewalks on one side of the street, and took that information and assessed the critical needed sidewalks based on a number of factors, including the functional classification of the roadway, whether sidewalk was missing on both sides of the street or just one side of the street, the proximity of that sidewalk to transit and to schools. We consider those pretty major pedestrian generators. And then we also used a scoring technique called centrality, which I'll dive into in the next slide, please. So we wanted to understand not just how are these sidewalks in terms of need with how close they are to things, but in our network, there are some parts of our street network that are what we call high betweenness, or they're really a critical segment where a trip needs to happen on it because it's connecting two major generators or two major populations. So we measured something called centrality to understand that. And what you're seeing on the screen is an example, and I think we can go to the next slide to see a bigger version of it. But streets that are maybe dead ends or aren't connecting two major population centers, It doesn't mean they're not important, but they may be less critical in the network. They may have other alternate options, and they may be lower stress to begin with because they're not carrying a lot of traffic. Whereas other streets, like in this example, Hampton Avenue, it's one of the few streets that goes all the way through the network with pretty much no detours through this portion of the neighborhood. And it's connecting a lot of households and places. So it ends up getting the red score there, which is a higher centrality score because it's really connecting a lot of households, a lot of people, and it's also critical in the network to do that. So we were trying to understand what are streets that limit out of direction travel and connect lots of populations together in order to just use it as another factor to screen where is it most critical that pedestrians move along our network. Next slide. And so we ended up coming up with out of all of our gaps, identifying the top 20% with that screening process that are considered critical need gaps. And some are gaps that are only on one side of the street, some are on both sides of the street, but all that has been factored into identifying how do we get to the top 20% of the most critically needed sidewalks in the system. And again, this is a Google map that we're going to make available to you all. We welcome you to take a deeper dive and give us more detailed feedback. Because there is a line on this screen doesn't mean that if there isn't a line on the screen, it doesn't mean that there isn't a sidewalk gap there. It just means we've identified these as what we consider critical needs sidewalks. Any questions on that? Otherwise, I think we can move to the next slide.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I was curious for that map. Is there a layer that shows where the bus stops are?
Can you go back a slide? So we can actually add that if you'd like. This is built off of a basic Google Maps layer. So I think if you go far enough in, it automatically comes up, but we can add that. It's not built into our layers.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next slide. So the last thing I'll talk about today are the crosswalk needs assessment. So again, we've looked at how are pedestrians moving along our network. Now we want to understand how do we permeate the network, and we at this scale and level, we really had to boil it down to identifying segments of roadway that have indicators that we might need to be adding additional crossings, be it at intersections or mid-block. And so what we did to screen for that was we looked at where are there long distances between existing controlled protected crossings, which we consider signalized pedestrian crossings. And then on top of that, where is there ped bike crashes happening that are crossing related, so we can actually filter out not just ped bike crashes are occurring on those segments, but crossing related crashes are occurring. Next slide. So we looked at the entire network and identified where are signalized crossings or intersections 1,200 feet or more apart. That was kind of a starting threshold to start to identify those segments. It doesn't mean that maybe there are segments that are less than that maybe need crossings, but these are the most critical places where we're exceeding 1,200 feet apart. And then further screen them, not really prioritizing them, but just identifying the number of ped bike crossing related crashes that are happening within those segments that are over 1,200 feet apart. And this is an example that came out with a pretty higher score than others. So this is Rio Grande Avenue. And you can see on this whole stretch of Rio Grande, there's There isn't a signalized crossing. There's the number 36 bus stop, which are across the street from each other. There is a school zone. There's Rio Grande Charter School there. I believe there's also another school a little bit farther south, so you can kind of see some crossing activity happening with relations to that. And there's also businesses to the east, the Clear Lake neighborhood to the west. So this came up on our study, and just wanted to show it as a case study of how that type of screening, the characteristics that kind of come up with the segments we were able to screen. We did not get into identifying specifically where crosswalks should be going and recommending those, just identifying these are segments that need to be taken a closer look at to identify new crossing opportunities. Next slide. So again, we have this on a Google map for you to explore at your leisure. We have them color coded. So if there's a segment there, it means for that whole segment, there isn't a signalized crossing. And then we've identified at a more broken down level where a number of ped bike crashes are occurring. Again, these aren't total ped bike crashes happening on these segments. These are just the crossing related ped bike crashes, or so crashes that were categorized as being related to crossing the street. So I think with that actually wraps up my portion of the ped bike needs assessment, and I'll just stop there for questions, or if we need to move on, Alex, we can do that too.
I just wanted to reemphasize something that Caitlin said about this crosswalk assessment. We're identifying those segments, and what we plan to do is, after, we adopt the 2045 plan later this year, working directly with our local agencies and going through the processes necessary to warrant and establish different types of pedestrian crossings. So this is an going back to the 2045 plan is not just about identifying projects, it's about identifying opportunities. This is one example of that. So even though we won't be identifying cost feasible, crosswalk projects per se, we will be identifying those opportunities that we can explore, in the coming years, in the coming months, to solve this pedestrian crossing challenge. So, and again, just as Caitlin mentioned, we'll be sending out the links to these Google Maps, so you can take a closer look at the locations within your purview.
Okay, great.
So if there are any questions, does anyone have any questions? If you do, I see one raised hand, I believe. So
Yes.
Graciela, you have your hand raised?
Yes, it's Graciela again. I think it would be helpful to also include the bus stop layer on the crosswalk assessment map as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Great, and Mayor McDonald?
Yeah, and Graciela hits a hot spot for us. And of course, in Maitland, every one of these topics is relevant, whether it's sidewalks, bike stress. We've got all of this because we've got all of this, big roadways, 70, 92 to work with. And Graciela is very aware, and others are as well, how important being able to move people around in a dense area, in an increasingly dense area. Crosswalks, sidewalks. We've got a bike ped master plan that we put into place, but to integrate this into a broader view with, area wide, these are extremely relevant questions for us. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Great. Before we move on, I believe that's it from our working group members. Members of the public who are viewing in and have questions or comments, we do have a public comment period later on in the agenda, where we'll enable you to participate later on in the discussion. But before we move on, does anyone else have any comments or insights they want to provide before we dive into transit? All right, seeing none.
We have one raised hand, Alex.
Right.
From Jeff Pigram.
Mr. Pegram.
Yes, just with the note about adding the bus stops, I would just ask that if we can reference the Sunrail stops as well, because I know there are challenges with that last mile connectivity for some pedestrians, for those as well.
Amen.
And I do think it's important to note, and I'm not sure if it was emphasized enough, as part of this crosswalk and that pedestrian analysis, the proximity to transit was a parameter or an attribute in the scoring process. So it was directly, part of the calculation for our work. So even though it may not be labeled on the map, its proximity in relationship to transit in schools, for that matter, those were key drivers, kind of key attributes that help projects kind of rise in this scoring process. So just wanted to emphasize that as well. But great comments. So let's move on to our next slide, please. Great, and I'll let Courtney take it from here.
Great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Courtney Reynolds. I'm the Transit Planning Manager in VHB's Orlando office. I've been in Central Florida for a number of years, and hopefully you recall getting an opportunity to work together in the past on the Transportation to Management, the TDM program in Central Florida area. But today, next slide, please. We are going to be focusing on transit. Now, as an essential element of the 2045 plan, transit will help us address the needs of our urbanizing, rapidly growing region. Support for and interest in transit was captured through Metro Plan Orlando's public involvement efforts, which hopefully doesn't come as a surprise. Through those efforts, it really documented a call for more frequent transit, serving more destinations, or simply put, just more buses to more places. The call for more service is shared by current Lynx riders who ranked frequent service as their top priority during the last Transit Development Plan, or TDP for short. Now, whereas the time horizon of the TDP effort is 10 years, our effort is going to be focused on a time horizon of 10 to 15 years. Now, the great thing about transit projects is that they often support multiple goals and objectives, demonstrating in a very concrete way how planning funds can align with policy objectives. Next slide, please. Thank you. To identify the region's transit needs, we will follow a 5-step approach outlined here on the slide. And then step 1, we will build on existing plans and studies to identify key issues and really come to understand existing initiatives. Next step, we will develop solutions based on best practices and an understanding of the region's available resources, working to identify potential solutions that can really work at a regional scale. Step 3 begins the process of identifying those cost-feasible and unfunded transit projects. And in the 4th step, an implementation timeline will be developed, identifying what needs to be done in the short term to bring those projects and programs to life. And this leads into the 5th step, identifying and analyzing strategies and policies that need to be revisited in order to achieve our regional transit vision. And all these steps will be done in close coordination with our agency partners at Lynx, Sunrail, and others. Next slide, please. So Metro Plan Orlando's board, they've focused on improving on-time performance, increasing transit system frequency, increasing ridership, and improving transit access to essential services and affordable housing. Now, understanding transit performance measures and what they mean provide us with a common vocabulary to analyze what's really going on and to propose improvements. I wanted to spend just 1 minute this morning differentiating between on-time performance and the idea of transit level of service, as they may sometimes be used interchangeably, but they do measure different things. So OTP for short, on-time performance, I think of it as measuring the reliability of the transit service. That question of how often does the bus or the train make it to the places at the time they say they're going to be there. It's an essential performance metric that speaks to the quality of service and is a key aspect of the ridership experience. If anyone's waited for the train or waited for the bus, you've probably experienced this firsthand. Sunrail is actually known for its excellent on-time performance, which as of the last Central Florida Commuter Rail Commission, they reported out at 97% on-time performance. Now that idea of transit level of service, I wanted to reference that as a simplified way to think about the waiting time between buses, also known as headways and the frequency. When transit level service, it's not a national standard. It was developed through a transit cooperative research program effort, but it provides a way to compare the service you currently have to the service you want. I think a great example, referencing a specific Lynx route, Link 8, which goes from Link Central Station in downtown Orlando, heads out of downtown using our awesome trail 441 down to Oak Ridge, on over International Drive, Service Convention Center, SeaWorld, ends up at outlets. That route, which actually accounts for 9% of the agency's overall daily boardings, that route has service every 12 to 15 minutes a day, depending on the time of day. So that would give it a transit level service of B to C. And there are examples of other Lynx routes where they actually have great frequency. Next slide.
Hey, Courtney.
Courtney, before we move on, we have a question from Dr. Dan.
Thank you very much. Hey, Courtney. Question, does your OTP analysis distinguish between early buses and late buses? And I say that, I know you mentioned, for those riders that have to wait for a late bus, or transit mode, whatever, understood, it's an inconvenience. But if that bus comes early to a stop, then you miss it. And so I think the early arrival is considerably more important than a late arrival. Do you guys distinguish between that in your analysis?
Well, each transit agency may kind of set that within itself. There's some examples like in Miami-Dade, they on-time performance, if you're 2 minutes earlier than the time point, then you're not hitting your on-time performance. But if you're 5 minutes later than a time point, and so because it's kind of at the discretion of the transit agency and how they want to measure, it doesn't always mean just 5 minutes before and after. There's some nuance there, but that 5 minute mark is kind of the common point.
Perfect. That's what I was looking for. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and I do. Miles O'Keefe is on the line today from Link, so just if there's an opportunity, Miles, to add anything there, I want to make sure you have the opportunity.
I'm good.
All right, so I think that's okay. So thank you for seeing the slides. All right, so the good news. And speaking of links, there's actually a lot of resources in terms of existing transit plans, from the state required transit development plan, TDP, to Lynx's 2018, the route optimization study. There was also an effort recently to identify what could be implemented in Orange County had the transportation sales tax referendum moved forward. So these plans, along with planning studies of the top corridors in Lynx's service area, like State Road 436, State Road 50, US 192, really provide the blueprint for the regional route map of transit service. Next slide. Great. So unsurprisingly, there are some key issues that inform these previous transit plans and will influence this process. Some of these issues are external to the transit agency, such as land use and a number of new micromobility operators that enter the local markets, particularly in downtown Orlando. Transit also has an evolving role in helping to solve multiple social issues, from affordable housing, critical issue here in Central Florida, access to healthcare, and climate change and resiliency plans. And there are issues that are internal to transit agencies, not the least of which has been historically limited funding, but also declining ridership trends. And that was before the COVID-19 pandemic. Nationwide, it's not a surprise that transit agencies have been suffering extreme dips in ridership, even where many essential workers continue to ride transit to get to work. It's all been on the downswing. I think it's safe to say we'll all be watching how Lynx, Sunrail, and others rebound once we get past this. And if anything, the pandemic highlighted all those diverse needs that transit agencies must meet, from paratransit and transportation disadvantaged riders to those frontline workers that depend on the service. There's also interest in active efforts locally to take advantage of alternative fuels and new vehicle types that promise improved efficiency of the fleet. Next slide. Oh, all right, and that brings me into the next speaker. So I'm going to pause there in case there's any additional questions, Alex.
Anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. And again, we will have a public comment period at the end of the agenda. But does any working group members have a question in regards to the transit approach or want to offer any insights? All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and move on.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thanks, Courtney, and good morning, working group. My name is Damond Hazley, and I'm the Transportation Planning Director at VHB, and I'm also the project manager for these efforts at the MTP. We have been tasked to conduct the transit analysis that Courtney just summarized, the roadway needs assessment, and any planning and environmental screenings necessary for the projects identified within the MTP. At this time, I'll focus specifically on our roadway and TISMO needs assessment. So as Alex noted, our methodology for the 2045 MTP is vastly different from the previous LRTPs. It does, however, continue Metro Plan's approach from the PPL, which uses multiple performance indicators to identify and prioritize projects. So we understand that the information we're going to provide is a lot. It would have been great to cover this in an in-person working group setting as originally planned, but please continue to use the raise hand feature. I'll be glad to stop and answer any questions that you have. We look forward to receiving your input and incorporating it into our process. Next slide. Thanks. So the roadway needs are being developed in the 4-step process. The first step includes aligning our performance indicators with the goals and objectives that have been adopted within this plan. This step will be key, and I'll walk through each alignment shortly. The next step, which is the needs assessment itself, includes using the data model to assign those performance indicators to the roadway network for a comprehensive assessment. These needs will not be limited to capacity. That first step of matching the indicators to goals really results in the needs list that represents all modes of travel. Step 3 is the project identification. This is simply identifying which of the 5 major project funding categories offer the best opportunity for improvement. And lastly, project prioritization. At this step in the process, the roadway network has been quantified based on all the indicators, and the needs have been assigned to project categories. We will use that quantitative assessment as our base and further prioritize based on qualitative reviews for checks and balances. Next slide, please. So let's get into step 1, which is the alignment of goals and objectives with performance indicators. Within this step, we are ensuring that our quantitative assessments match the vision and planning policies of the NPO. This step also provides decision makers with the best information available and guides investment through a data-informed process. Next slide, please. So the first of the 5 goal areas is safety and security, and I'm sure you guys have seen these goals already. In each of these goal areas, I'll discuss the assessment criteria that is listed in the blue box on the left, then give an example of how these indicators will lead to identifying our needs. You'll also hear me refer to point allocations for the indicators. This relates to the actual evaluation within the data model, and that process will be explained next. So within the safety and security goal, a couple of major objectives are to eliminate the rate and occurrence of traffic fatalities, injuries, and crashes, and to provide infrastructure and services to help prepare for, respond to, and recover from emergencies. The indicators assigned to this goal quantify our network's ability to achieve these objectives. As you can see, we're evaluating the network for overall crash rates, fatal and serious injury rates, and ped and bike crashes. The last indicator also recognizes that our designated evacuation routes should be prioritized for improvements to facilitate the efficient travel in emergency situations. Going to the right of the slide, I would give an example of how a performance indicator can lead to identifying a need. In this case, crash rate. To evaluate, we will calculate the crash rate on each individual corridor within a region. The crash scores will be ranked from highest to lowest, and our logic is the higher the crash rate, the greater the need and the great point allocation within our data model. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Demond. Lisa, can we go back to the one slide, please? Perfect, thank you.
Okay, thank you. The second MTP goal is reliability and performance. Key objectives that support this goal are the improvement of travel time reliability on the transportation system and an enhancement of the region's ITS, adaptive, and actively managed traffic system. Again, our indicators are as shown on the left respond to these objectives directly. We evaluate travel time reliability for both auto and commercial vehicles, and we identify the roadways which do not have fiber or are not actively monitored and score them for potential improvement. The recent ITS master plan for the NPO will be a key source of information for this, and MetroPlan's vision of a connected network, which allows for real-time traffic operations, will be supported by this needs list. The last indicator, which is the relative change of congested speeds, is an indicator that utilizes the Central Florida Regional Planning Model to evaluate the decrease in travel speed between the 2045 model and the base year 2015 model. The logic is corridors which show the largest decrease in speed indicate the greatest need and will be scored highest in the needs data model. Next slide, please. So the objectives of the access and connectivity goal are really centered around increasing transit service and headways for decreasing headways for high population and employment areas and reducing the reliance on a single occupant vehicle. The indicators assigned to this goal include the evaluation of transit service related to their headway, population and jobs, as well as the identification of attractions along the corridor, such as food and health opportunities, cultural and recreational land uses, and the sidewalk analysis as presented earlier. The example indicator that I will highlight for this goal is the population within a half mile of transit. This indicator looks at two components. First, it quantifies the population along the corridor, but then it correlates that population to the availability of a transit stop. The logic being, the greater the population with no access to transit, the greater the need. Next slide, please. Moving on to health and environment. This goal aims at linking health impacts with transportation planning, which is unique in this plan. The objectives of this goal include providing transportation solutions that contribute to improved public health, reducing adverse health impacts associated with physical inactivity, and preventing disproportionate adverse impacts of transportation projects on minority and low-income populations. 6 performance indicators were included in the assessment criteria, and I won't go through each of them on this, but I will again highlight an example criteria in use. The public health indicator rates are being evaluated to quantify the population with health issues associated with physical inactivity along the corridor. For the purpose of this assessment, the 3 indicators included were asthma, obesity, and diabetes. The rates of these health indicators were then compared to the availability of sidewalks and bike lanes on the corridor, with the logic being the greater the health risk, the greater the need for active transportation options. We were able to develop this assessment and link health impacts to our transportation network through the use of VHB's Healthy Mobility tool. We have a couple of slides forthcoming to highlight this tool, and the NPO is also developing a recording overview of the tool in the coming weeks. Next slide, please. Moving on to investment and economy. Within this goal, the indicators were derived to address objectives such as reducing the delay for residents, visitors, and businesses, and promoting transportation projects that expand and enhance economic prosperity. In achieving these objectives, one main component is ensuring that our needs list promotes and supports efficient freight movement throughout the region. The first three indicators are reflective of this, with the percentage of commercial vehicles, the identification of statewide truck bottlenecks, and the evaluation of corridors which serve heavy industrial areas. The other indicators focus on increasing the affordability of transportation and housing options, such as quantifying the number of cost-burdened households along a corridor and improving the experience of visitors by prioritizing corridors which serve large percentages. The example at right provides the flow and logic for the intensity and proximity to freight-intensive land uses. This measure again utilizes the Central Florida Regional Planning Model and ensures that we are capturing the corridors in our needs list that serve the land uses supportive of freight. Next slide, please. So before we move on to step 2 of the process, I'll pause here for questions and see if there are any raised hands.
Damon, you can proceed.
Okay. So the previous slide made the previous slides made mention of point allocations and scoring through a data model. The next few slides will explain this process in greater detail and describe how we're using a multi-criteria quantifiable process to identify needs. At this time, I'll turn it over to Keith Smith to lead us through this process, and you could go ahead and click to the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Damon. Good morning, everyone. So as we're taking a look at this, as Damon was talking through these different indicators and these different pieces that we're looking at, one of the big key aspects of this is that it is a heavily data-driven approach. And we really are looking at this from a multimodal solution, which was evident from the variety of the different indicators that Damon was referring to. Right, currently, we do have over 25 that we're looking at. And what's good about that as well is that we are dragging in and sort of bringing in data sources from a number of places. Taking a look at signal forfeit crash data, bringing in streetlights to allow us to understand what that speed profile looks like, as well as bringing in modeling data, and then several other data sets are available from our local and partnering agencies. Next slide, please. So the actual data model itself, the way that this works is we're taking and we're grouping each of these different indicators into those goal areas that Damon was just talking through. And we're bringing all this into GIS so that we're able to actually do a conflation process, sort of bringing in apples to apples comparison so that we're actually looking at the road network and bringing all these different indicators to that road network so that we're evaluating it. For instance, when we talked about the percentage of population within a half mile of a corridor, we're actually looking at every single corridor and evaluating that, as well as looking at the other different types of factors that are available, such as the presence of bike lanes and some of the different indicators that are actually very specific to the built environment around that. This entire model is fully automated and runs completely through GIS and actually creates the output scores for us as part of that needs assessment through a button click, which is very nice because that means that as things are needing to be adjusted or as those scores and those point values that Damon were indicating and we start looking at that, it's very easy to go in there, make those adjustments, have the model rerun again, and continually give us an updated needs output, which will play into something I'll talk about in just a few minutes. Next slide, please. So this is the actual dashboard of one of the outputs that we have currently. And this is taking a look at all those different categories as we're pulling it together. And this will continue to evolve so that it actually will be able to be very specific for each of the 5 major areas that we're looking at, as well as providing a good comprehensive list of scoring of all of the different segments within the entire Metroplan area. You can actually see them sort of listed down the left. This just happened to be the early version that we ran, the sort of iterative process of what we were seeing. Can we go ahead and go to the next slide, please? So let me talk a little bit about what we're sort of seeing on there and how we interpret this. And again, this is something that is sort of still evolving and will be changing, but the general idea around this is that we're going to provide that filterable list of corridors ranking from worst to best performing on the left. Now, everything that happens after that is all tied back to this list, making it very easy to navigate around inside of this dashboard. So if you were to select any one of these different corridors over there on the side, such as Metro West Boulevard, Eastbrook Boulevard, or any of those that are scoring with the higher point values, I mean, they are having the worst performance. All of the additional items that are being shown on the screen are also going to update, as well as in the dashboard. So that way you start to be able to actually look at the score by category of each of those 5 goal groups Damon referenced and understand which one of those is actually sort of scoring the highest, so that we can begin to understand which of the goal areas is that particular corridor in need of the most attention. Is this something related to safety? Is this something related to health? Or is it more related to performance? In addition to that, we're also going to have in that top right corner a very detailed list available so that you can take a look at any one of these 5 different goal areas and understand exactly what any one of those indicators values look like. And that's great because we still have the cumulative score that helps drive the model to tell us sort of which ones are ranked in what order. But this also helps give a little bit more depth and analysis so that if it is something that's coming up with safety and security, you can take a closer look and understand it really is the crash rate around that that's driving it, or this is a roadway that has is very dangerous for pedestrians, or different types of factors like that. So we can understand a little bit more about what's happening there. The lower panels actually give us a way of looking at it from this indicator base of sort of a gauged idea. So the way we're doing this currently is you see there's one on the top there that's a 4.7, and then the one below is a 9.7. And what this is indicating is the 4.7 is sort of giving you a overall average of all the different roadways that we're looking at, just to kind of give a baseline so that there's some sort of value associated with it. So if I say that this particular roadway is scoring at a 9.7, there's some context around, okay, how much worse than average is that actually performing, as well as just providing a good, easy way to looking at that. Everything that we do is also very driven by GIS, which does allow it all to be very map-centric. And that's what you're seeing in that lower right panel. And you actually would have seen on the screen before, if you remember, we had a large map. As you click around, the map updates, the map zooms, and all the map corridors that you're going to see are all color-coded. So that way it starts to be able to help present the data in a little bit of a informational way so that you can identify, is this a length of corridor that's 3 or 4 miles long and we're consistently having problems throughout it? Is this a very isolated issue? Is this a interchange issue or an intersection issue? And what are some of those different relationships of how they work? The map also is very dynamic. So if you click on any one of those different corridor segments, it'll go ahead and pop up the detailed table as well. So that way it gives you just a little bit different way of be able to dive in and understand some of the data and what's happening on that screen. Next slide, please. The healthy mobility tool that Damon was referring to is also featured inside of this as one of those different indicators that we're looking at. And there'll be a lot more about this in the coming weeks, but really the driver behind this is that the tool that we have gives us the ability to take a very detailed, very close look and understand a little bit more about what's happening. What are those different percentages of the population that are at risk for each one of these different categories of the chronic diseases. And this actually came about as part of the CDC's 500 Cities project that was done back in 2016. We've been able to take that through a statistical model and bring it forward, looking at all these different health indicators, build out environments, and all total, there's about 125 different performance indicators that we're looking at in understanding sort of what those different impacts are so that we can be able to evaluate clearly and understand what are the different risks that the population is facing and what does some of those look like. Can we have the next slide, please? Here you can actually see an example of sort of how that works. What you're seeing on the kind of larger map is actually sort of the statewide average of the risk assessment, just to understand which one of these different census tracts are we seeing that has the highest risk and which one of those 6 chronic diseases does it associate with. We also have the ability to click on it, which is what you're seeing center highlighted there in the blue outline. And that gives us the ability to actually evaluate that particular census tract one by one to understand what's happening. And of course, we can also group this up by county as well as the entire Metro Plan area, helping us get a really good comprehensive picture of where those areas that are within the Metro Plan area that are at higher risk for these different diseases, and be able to start looking at some of the built environment and some of those other factors that go into health, and understand what are some of the things that we can do to help improve that. How can we go about doing that? And really be able to start targeting in on certain locations to say, if this is a particular area that's scoring poorly, what are some of those things that we can do there that might actually help improve that overall? Next slide, please. So as we're doing this also, one of the things that's good about the model that I'd mentioned is that it is very dynamic and allows us to run this very quickly. So as you see here, we're talking about scenario comparisons. One of the things that we're actually doing with this is going through alternative scenario analysis. So that as we go through and we do this, the data model itself will be able to actually be reevaluated and updated with these different alternative scenarios. And that will again be fed back into the model so that the scores are continually updating so that we do consistently get sort of a good update to make sure that that needs list that we're identifying is built not just on current data, but also on some of the scenario data that's coming out of the model. And that scenario data is able to take into account some of these different alternatives that are being evaluated. And it really does give us a true quantitative and qualitative assessment, which for doing this type of analysis is extremely handy and very important to be able to do that. You can kind of see how those different things overlap there on the diagram about where the needs really do start to sort of pop up at those locations where we find that we are consistently seeing these same corridors coming up. So that way we're not only looking at trying to use a singular indicator to try to locate where our needs really are, but we're sort of bringing together the entirety of this whole process and be able to really look at it comprehensively. Next slide, please.
Keith, I'm sorry, before we move on, I know we have a question from Venice, I believe in regards to the healthy community work. Venice? Unmute yourself, please. I know your question was about particular reports, but can you provide a little more to your question?
Here at the Florida Department of Health in Seminole County, this would be very useful when we're applying for specific grants. Can we submit a request for specific areas?
Yeah, so the way that we've done the model is we've first based everything off of the entire state just to get a good statewide average. And that was important for us because we need to get enough statistical accuracy to feel confident we could move around from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and especially filling in those cases where we don't have health data readily available. Right now, currently, we have the entire model done statewide. We're working with MetroPlan to do it specifically for those 3 counties areas. We do also have the ability to drill in and do that. The only kind of piece of that comes into play is that when we start going down to, say, a county level, we do have to keep an eye on the number of indicators versus the number of census tracts that are available. Because this is statistical analysis, we have to make sure that we're getting a balance in there that allows that still to be statistically sound so that we're not sort of allowing anything to sway that. But based off the statewide average that we currently have, as well as the work we're doing with MetroPlan, the answer is yes. We can drill into that and find it. The risk side of it is pretty much ready to go. And then that sort of that next level analysis where we're actually getting closer and trying to understand what the built environment looks like and how do we go about doing that. That takes a little bit more time because there is some additional data that's needed to be put together in order to make that work.
This is excellent. Thank you.
No problem.
And Keith, before we move on, we do have a question from Graciela. But before I recognize Graciela, I know we're at just a little after 11. We have I would say about less than 10 minutes left in the presentation. So if you can, with the meeting today, so if you can bear with us, it would be great. But of course, this meeting is recorded. If you do have to drop off, you can always check back in. But if you can stay, please do. I apologize for running a little long. Go ahead, Graciela.
The dashboard feature is really effective in just kind of looking at the tangible impacts that you might experience based on whatever those impacts are. I'm curious whether the dashboard and perhaps even some of the scenario comparisons can pull in whether it's future land use or platted lots that haven't yet been developed, just to show what the future impact may be, as well as if there's any infrastructure kind of reliever programs and what that impact may be as you apply them in that dashboard.
Right. So right now, the way that we're approaching the dashboard is we are focused on the 5 main goals is what's going into the model itself. As far as being able to visualize additional layers on the dashboard that can be turned on and off on the map, that's really not a big problem. I think it's probably just more of an understanding of what layers we'd want to see on there and what layers people would find the most value to, especially if there are already layers that are available. I know, for instance, a lot of the future land use mapping, I think the Regional Planning Council has been doing that for a number of years, and several of those are made available, as well as the individual ones from the county for zoning and things. So as long as they're available and can be served up through Esri's ArcGIS platform, they can be simply turned on there. That way you can just turn on a checkbox within the map and you'll be able to see those different layers there and available. So that does help with that. So it won't be included into the model at this time, but it will. They very well can be simply added to the map as informational. And we actually have noticed that as we've gone through this with the list of the 25 indicators that we are looking at as part of the different goals, there are a number of other things that we've identified along the way that are very good for information that are very difficult to get into a model when we're looking at scoring just because of sort of how they're represented. But we know there are additional data sets and different data layers that people will want to be able to see. So that's our intention at this time, is to just put them on the map so that you can turn them on, turn them off, and actually view them, but they won't be incorporated into the scoring process.
And I'll add that if your question is related to some of the 2045 socioeconomic data, that is in the model, and there are indicators that will use that and kind of compare that 2045 data to the 2015 base model to recognize where there are changes and incorporate those into the needs list.
Yeah, just planning for anticipated impacts that we might not see with an analysis of the current situation may help inform just prioritizing funding recommendations as well.
Yeah, understood.
Okay. Were there any other questions?
Mayor McDonald, did you have a question? You're on mute, sir.
Thank you. I live in a redevelopment world and a future land use world. And so that's going to be extremely valuable to be able to see what that looks like going forward.
Great. I think just something else that I think is notable, you know, at the MPO, we're also working on developing what we're calling a data viewer. It's going to be an online map that's going to allow, it's probably going to include probably 30 to 50 different spatial data points where members of the public, each of you will able to kind of zoom into an interactive map and see all of these various data sets that we talked about. So that's something that I'm hoping to be wrapping up. It's another one of my projects that I'm hoping to be wrapping up here in the next 3 to 4 weeks. And as soon as that's completed, we will definitely send that out to the working group and publish that on the Metro Plan Orlando website. So great questions. Keith, can you proceed?
Okay, next slide, please. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Damon to finish it out.
Okay, all right, thanks, Keith. So once the needs are identified, the next step really is to group the corridors into the project funding categories that address the issues. Next slide, please. So the needs will be assigned within the following categories. These categories are consistent with those included in other Metro Plan improvement programs. I'm sure you're familiar with them, but this will allow the efficient movement of projects from the LRTP at the top eventually down to the TIP. So as a refresher, the NHS and state roads, this includes our capacity projects and needs based on targets for safety, travel time, and reliability. It's important to note that our project list will recognize the current capacity projects in the PPL for this category. The multimodal system roadway and complete streets project list, this includes our non-capacity context sensitive projects that use a combination of multimodal strategies to improve flow on constrained roadways without adding lanes. The next category is multimodal system TISMO projects. These are the projects that alleviate traffic congestion on existing roadways without adding capacity and utilizes methods such as turn lanes or ITS solutions, amongst others. The regional trail and safe route to school projects is another category which will build upon the current PPL. It will include local and regional trail projects, on-street bicycle lanes, and sidewalk improvements. And lastly, transit projects. Those will be representative of the quantified needs that we presented, the existing premium transit priorities, and the regional transit assessment that Courtney presented earlier. Next slide, please. So getting back into this idea of using a quantitative assessment, once we understand the project, the categories and their opportunity and intent, this spreadsheet illustrates how we will utilize only the relevant performance indicators to assign each need into a project category. So for example, the NHS and state roads will utilize all the performance indicators from the first two goals, safety and security and reliability and performance. But three of the access and connectivity performance measures, transit, headway, population, and jobs, those won't weigh in the category needs into this project type. Then likewise, the trails and safe route to school category will not utilize the reliability and performance goal indicators, as these indicators aren't relevant to that improvement type. So this slide highlights our first three goals, and the remaining goal areas are presented on the next slide. The advantage of using the data model that Keith previewed is really we're able to identify these needs and project priorities and recalculate the results through simple adjustments of these frameworks. So through feedback and discussion, we can walk through these lists and understand if there is a performance indicator that we may think relates to another goal area, quickly include that and rerun the model. Next slide, please. So here's the sheet 2. Again, the project categories are linked to the applicable indicators. I'll pause here on this sheet. I don't know how much time we have, Alex, but I don't know if we want to receive comment now or just provide this matrix to the working group for further comment.
Either or. I know we're running tight on time. I know it's a lot to take in at once, so we'll include this matrix as well as the other slides in our meeting record, and this is also going to be going to the advisory committees soon with some technical documentation to really outline our prioritization approach and the criteria that we're considering. You know, I think when we look at this slide here, just a quick summary is, you know, I think what's very notable is we are considering environmental justice populations, our transportation equity areas for every investment that we are making, as well as those health indicators. So I think that's notable and absolutely a best practice. You know, when you look at, you know, across the United States, that, you know, we are considering in our needs assessment and in our prioritization process, directly in our calculations for investment, health, as well as, you know, serving environmental justice populations, not just mitigating adverse impacts, but investing in those areas. And I apologize that my video is off, but we can go to the next slide, please.
So the last step represents the project prioritization. So by use of a data model, the needs and projects, they're already ranked and placed in the order based on those cumulative scores and performance indicators. But we do understand that checks and balances are necessary to round out this process. And we're conducting qualitative assessments of need, which would not be conducted in the captured in the data model. Next slide, please. So the prioritization checks and balances are presented on this slide. First, we'll be checking the prioritized needs list to make sure we're capturing those existing FDOT and local government priorities. Same goes for the previous LRTP as applicable, the PPL and the TIP. Freight mobility plans is another area where qualitative assessments will be conducted. Corridors which have been identified to be critical to freight may be further prioritized, and the plan will include considerations for truck parking needs across the region. The methodology and resultant needs list will also be cognizant to include the existing efforts of Metro Plan, such as safety studies being conducted on over 10 corridors now, constrained corridors which should be prioritized for multimodal improvements, and other recently completed system-wide plans, transit plans, and bike ped action plans. So in closing, this section of the presentation summarized our methodology and resources for developing the needs and project priorities. This concludes the information that I have, and again, we're here to answer any questions if we have any.
So I know we're a little over on time, and I really appreciate everyone sticking with us this morning. Does anyone have any quick questions or insights they want to offer before we move on to the next section of the agenda? You know, as I mentioned, we will be providing this information, you know, as part of our meeting record and coordinating again with our advisory committees to help refine and build consensus on the prioritization criteria. But without seeing any, we'll move on to the next slide. So just very quickly, go to the next slide on next steps. The next slide, please, Lavani. Thank you. So, we're wrapping, as we've presented, we're moving through the scenario planning and needs assessment process using these methodologies to actually conduct the analysis, which we've done some preliminary analysis so far, but we're going to be refining that. As my colleague Laura Bach has presented to you, I believe 2 meetings ago, regarding the congestion management process, which is a standalone document, but an element that we incorporate in the 2045 plan as well, focuses in on those near-term, non-recurring and recurring congestion and reliability challenges. She's going to be presenting that to our advisory committees, an update to that work to our advisory committees here in the next few weeks, so stay tuned on that. We're continuing working with our local government partners on preparing financial forecasts, both in illustrative forecasts as well as in the projecting existing resources into the future. And some of our next steps that we're going to be initiating is really our health and environmental analyses. As Damon and Keith mentioned, we will be preparing a pre-recorded video on the healthy mobility tool to provide more information on that, given the importance of that, and given some of our time constraints. We're going to prepare a detailed video about what it is and what it can do and how we're going to be utilizing that in our planning process for this plan, but also as Metro Plan Orlando moves forward. And at the end of the day, what long-range plans are all about is really identifying cost-feasible projects to be programmed in our short-term planning documents. So, we go through all of these comprehensive analyses to basically identify the projects that will help us accomplish our regional goals and objectives. And I hope we made that clear today, that it's not about solving for congestion. It's really about accomplishing those overarching, comprehensive goals and objectives that really amount to quality of life, and doing that in a robust way, but also a replicable way, in a very transparent way for our analysis. So as we prepare our technical documentation for what we've presented today, it will be very clear on how we're coming to our conclusions, so we can move forward. We can go to the next slide, please. So in the next slide again, please. So again, the working group meets next in August. It's about 2 months from now. In the interim, we'll be continuing work, internally with our technical team, as well as taking work to our advisory committees. And the board will be adopting the plan in December of this year, but we'll be meeting twice in advance of that. Go to the next slide. Go one more slide, please, Alani. So now we've come to the public comment period on the agenda. So if any members of the public wish to make a comment, please use the raise hands function and you'll be recognized. Or if you're just on the phone, you can dial *9 on your phone keypad and we'll unmute your mic after you're recognized. Please state your name and address for the record, as you would if this was a formal face-to-face meeting. And please limit your comments to 2 minutes or less. Lisa, Cynthia, do we have any comments? Members wishing to make a comment?
Hello.
I believe I see Joanne's hand. Joanne, how are you? Please go ahead.
Fine. I finally got to you. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Yeah, I'd like to have the 24-hour bus and train service, including holidays, weekends, and nighttime, please, because I don't want to see anybody getting stranded like that, the way they did now, even in the COVID-19 and stuff, because we just had a bad crash last week, and I wasn't happy about that at all. Even when I wasn't there. But still, no, I crashed in a train a week ago, and I wasn't happy about that. That some of us had to ride the bus home, and I didn't like it either. that please give us a 24-hour bus service, including holidays, weekends, and nighttime, and so that no one would be stranded, especially coming home from the 4th of July things or Christmas gala or whatever heck that is, and stuff like that. And we need to bus over to, we need to fix my bus over at the Oviedo Boulevard as I come on to and from the Special Olympic swim practice. And we need the bus here in Country Clubs. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Country Club Road here, the corner of the Williams too, and a place like that. And we need the bus over there in Sanford, up there over at Lake Mary.
Great. Thank you so much, Joanna. And I think she really echoes the comments that we receive globally in regards to, more buses to more places and having that done as soon as possible. So thank you for your comment, Joanna. It's definitely heard, and I'm really happy for you to participate in our virtual meeting today. Were there any other members wishing to make public comment?
I don't see anybody else, Alex.
Great. We can go to the next slide, please. So before we adjourn, I just wanted to provide, working group members an opportunity to provide any other comments, feedback, or direction. Again, I really appreciate you bearing with us today. And I do apologize for going longer than expected. So that's it for me. I do see Mayor McDonald. You have a hand raised. Go ahead. Unmute yourself, sir.
Yes, Alex, I just want to thank you folks for allowing me to participate, and I look forward to the opportunity to sit in and participate in your future meetings. This is terrific.
Thank you, sir. Does anyone else have any comments or feedback they want to provide before we close up? All right, seeing none, again, I want to thank everyone for hanging in with us today. Hope we covered a lot of ground, but we will be preparing, as I mentioned earlier, a meeting record, which will include the slides and the links to some of our preliminary findings from our bicycle and pedestrian needs assessment. So you'll be hearing back from us soon. So again, thank you so much, everyone. We're going to be signing off now. Have a great day.